Hi, this video is going to be all about tips and advice on how to play an RPG session where there is just one game master and one player. That's a one-on-one type of experience. I'm also going to go into the reasons as to why that could happen, the pros and cons, and some ways in which you could solve some potential problems, and just some additional tips and advice by the end of this video that will make it easier for you to play a role-playing game with just one player and one game master. This video came out as a sort of idea from a conversation that I had with Joe Koo, one of my viewers. Hi Joe. So he basically said that he enjoyed playing RPGs with just one game master, one player, especially those games that feature investigation and detective work. So let's start with some reasons as to why you would want to play a role-playing game with just one player and one game master. Because sometimes just one member of your group is interested on a particular game or genre. Maybe you have your RPG group, but they are only interested in playing sci-fi games or fantasy games, or maybe a subgenre such as weird horror or cyberpunk. So it's somewhat difficult for you to bring some niche RPG that is out of the group's liking or taste or area of expertise. Even some groups, it's not that they are not into a particular genre or subgenre. Maybe they just have a difficult time adapting to the genre. They haven't read too many stories featuring that sort of story or a theme or plotline. So it's very difficult for you to introduce new games to your table. But maybe there is one person in your group that is interested in playing that niche RPG that you have been waiting to bring to the table all along. So that's one reason as to why you could do this. Maybe you have time to run a short campaign or perhaps even a longer campaign on the side. You could tell that person that if she or he is interested in playing that one-on-one type of role-playing game. That's one reason as to why you will want that one-on-one experience. Another reason is that maybe you want to tell a story that features a lone protagonist. So maybe you have this role-playing game, but you want to play that game as a sort of Robert E. Howard type of experience in the lines of Conan the Barbarian or Solomon Kane. You want this lone protagonist taking on the world on his own, and that's a perfect excuse to talk to someone who's into that sort of story as well and ask them if they are interested in playing that sort of game, that sort of character. Another reason would be because you are not very confident on how to run a specific system, and it's easier to handle a single player. There are some really crunchy systems out there, or that have some very intricate and specific rules. They are robust systems that are not exactly easy to learn, at least not after a few sessions or test run sessions, but you still want to start that campaign or have a one shot that proceeds somewhat smoothly. That's a reason as to why you will have only one person playing that game, because sometimes it's more difficult to take a group of, let's say, 4 or 5 people and try to teach the rules to all of them. There's always one or two players that perhaps have some questions, or they have doubts, or they didn't understand something about the rules, the spells, some sort of ability or power, or anything related to the core system. And maybe later on, the session, if not ruined, it is somewhat slowed down a bit because of some things that were not clear. Actually, it was like 8 or 9 years ago, I was running a Pathfinder game, and there was this player that didn't understand how to roll initiative. He got confused as to the way that you had to add modifiers, dexterity and such, and when to apply certain things during spells and skill checks. So it was only later on during that session where we noticed some nonsensical things or inconsistencies, and then we have to clarify things, but that's just a very minor example. Maybe the problem could be somewhat greater, and you could have a lot of inconsistencies throughout the campaign just because that player did not ask the game master about a particular rule, because some people sometimes they get a bit shy about asking about these things. Maybe they think that they're going to be thought of as not as smart as the rest of the group. So that's one reason as to why you want just a single player when you are just learning a system, because this goes on the game master side of things as well. Maybe as a game master you are still trying to understand a particular rule set, and it's much easier for you to teach it to just one person and see how it actually runs in the game, and you get a better grasp of that rule or anything related to that system that you were having trouble with. Let's see. And the other reason, because you only have one player, of course. Sometimes you do not have a complete RPG group and you only have one person. I think this is very important, and it goes into the missed opportunities side of things. There have been a few times, perhaps like 3 times in my life, where I only had one person that was interested in playing RPGs. And it's not that I've been playing role-playing games all my life. There have been some moments, some years even, where I didn't have a group. So, but sometimes I had at least one person that was interested, and in some cases we actually had a satisfying short campaign. But I remember this one time where there was this guy that wanted to play Werewolf the Apocalypse, and we still needed more people. He was the only person interested, and I said, let's go for it, let's just start playing one-on-one and see how it goes. But he wanted to wait for more people and more people and more people. It was in college, so we spent an entire semester trying to look for other people, and the time went by. We didn't get a chance to play, and later on with other semesters, each one got occupied with different assignments and tests and projects, so it was no longer possible for us to play. So that was a missed opportunity just because that player wanted to have a bigger group. And I knew that it was actually possible to play one-on-one, because a couple of years back in high school I also only had one player, but that player decided to start the campaign, because I told that player, well, we can always add people later on, let's just get things moving. So we had a short campaign. It's better than no campaign at all, and it was quite an enjoyable experience. It was there was a few difficult there were a few difficult things, but it was a positive experience overall, and I will give you some tips and advice in a while as to how to avoid some problems. So those are just a few reasons as to why you would want to play a one-on-one session. Now let's go into the positives, the reasons as to why you would want that to happen. Maybe, of course, I already mentioned a bit of this. You get to run that niche RPG that would otherwise never be brought to the table. There are many role-playing games that are just sitting there accumulating dust on your shelf or your virtual shelf. If you buy a lot of PDFs, you have all those RPGs and they're just sitting there and nobody plays them. So that's really disappointing. Of course, you can also run them as solo experiences, perhaps using Mythic, but it's if you're looking for that multiplayer type of experience that is the standard in role-playing games, of course you want more people to play with you. So it's better to get those systems running. Even if you only have one player, it's better not to let those games go to waste just sitting there. So that's a way in which you can play many systems throughout your life. Another positive will be that your campaign is focused on a particular player's taste or actions, and you can predict things, and it becomes much easier to handle improvisation. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this video, I think they overlap a bit with things that you would find in RPGs that are focused on the one-on-one experience, such as Kevin Crawford's Scarlet Heroes or Godbound, or even Stars Without Numbers, the second edition. I already got that one. It's really good. I have yet to review it. I reviewed the first edition, but you even have an optional system to have a really powerful player character, and we'll talk about that later on. So some things that are described in Kevin Crawford's books, I think they they are somewhat similar to what I talk about here. So yes, because you're focused on that particular player's expectations on the campaign, on the adventures, it's a lot easier for you to plan ahead. Sometimes you have this group of 3 or 4 people, and you have to think about what they are expecting of the adventure. Not that you have to focus or customize the entire adventure campaign on each one of them, but you still want to present some satisfying moments. That maybe there is a player that likes a lot of battles, so you want some combat heavy encounters. There is another player that likes to get into places where he shouldn't be at, or borrow some things, so you prepare some adventures that focus on thieving moments. And maybe another player likes magic, etc. So you want to customize the adventure, the campaign for that player. Or if you're using you purchased a module, you want to make sure that you understand those encounters that are to the player's liking, so that you can how would you say, adapt them to the group if necessary. And so improvisation becomes much easier, because with one single player you already know more or less how that player is going to act based on his player character's personality. So you can plan ahead, and you are not cut off unaware of certain off the rails moments. It's much easier, and it's a lot easier to match schedules. Of course, if you only have one person, it's much easier to come into some sort of agreement or arrangement as to when you are going to play. Because imagine if you have like a group of 5 or 6 people, you all need to set aside one day to play RPGs, and sometimes it's just not possible. Especially nowadays, people are so busy. So having just one player, it's almost it's quite easy for you to just set aside a particular evening to play a role-playing game. You just need to make your to fit your schedule or the other player's schedule with that session, and it happens on its own. It's quite easy. And then let's talk about negatives or cons. A potential decrease of skill sets or powers that limits avenues of adventure. There are many systems that depend a lot on having an entire group of characters, of specialized player characters. A good example would be Hackmaster. In Hackmaster, you at the very least you need 3 player characters. It's a very realistic game, quite simulationist. So a single fighter, a single assassin, a single cleric is not going to be able to make it. There are so many factors that could end the careers of those characters, even outside of combat. So if you're expecting your fighter to go into a dungeon alone, even if he is surrounded by, let's say you have a 5 level or 6 level type of fighter, and you are surrounded by a bunch of goblins or kobolds. In other games, it could be quite easy, or relatively easy, for the fighter to take care of all of those kobolds and goblins, especially if they only have a few hit points each. But in Hackmaster, a single orc or a single goblin or kobold, if they get lucky, they can actually end up decapitating your character. It's very gritty and realistic. It is recommended that the players are as opportunistic as possible in combat. So in games like Hackmaster, where there is a lot of teamwork involved, and where you have to really plan and strategize before engaging with the enemy, it's not possible to have just a single player character. You could also modify the rules perhaps, but it wouldn't be Hackmaster. It would be a completely different experience. Another negative, going back to that, of course, just to make it a bit more clear, of course, you, as in the case of Hackmaster, you need at the very least someone who is good at fighting, someone who is good at healing, someone who is good at magical things, could be clerical or sorceress type of affairs, and someone with many skills to scout ahead or unlock things, disarm traps, etc. You know, the typical 4 members in a classic RPG fantasy party. So yeah, your skill sets will be reduced But for all of these cons and negatives, I will give some solutions later on. Then another negative thing could be there could be awkward moments of silence or inaction if the player is shy during one-on-one situations. There are some strange or peculiar players out there. They are quite extroverted or quite talkative when they are in a group environment, but when they are one-on-one with just one person in the room, they become like they almost look like they shut in. They do not communicate. They rarely talk. They are not proactive. So you have to keep that in mind. Some players are simply not into one-on-one type of games. So if you have that type of person, it could be difficult, if not impossible, to run a one-on-one game. Then you have that you could get a reduced mental toolbox, just one mind taking on a single adventure or campaign. You just have one person. This is very different from, let's say, 4 people who are trying to figure out some sort of mystery or puzzle. A single person would have to be a genius to take on all of the challenges, and even some challenges rely a lot on luck, on general knowledge of many things, and a single person simply cannot match the mental resources of an entire team. Sure, it also depends on a decent, let's say, decent intelligence on the part of everyone. As long as your group doesn't have a collective IQ of 42, you're going to do quite well with just, let's say, 3 or 2 people. But a single person could find some difficult moments where he didn't come up with some idea or clever way on how to solve some difficult problem. So yes, as sometimes it could be too taxing or overwhelming for a single player to take on a challenge, or several challenges, of course. Now I'm going to tell you some tips and advice on how to tackle these negatives. First, when playing or designing parts of the adventure and campaign, where there is just a single player character, you need to challenge that player character in his or her area of expertise. So let's say that you are playing a sci-fi game and your player decided to play as a hacker. Of course, you're going to introduce many moments where he has to get into a system and perhaps manipulate some sort of mechanism or device using all of his tools so that he can hack into that system. But if you get that player character into combat situations and he is not geared for that, he's going to be destroyed. So it's all about designing encounters that focus more on that character's area of expertise. If you have a character that is more on the diplomatic side of things, you want to have all those meetings and social interactions rather than combat all the time. So it's all about focusing on that. If you have a soldier type of character, you want a lot of combat encounters and just a few moments when perhaps he needed some sort of skill or device outside of his normal area of expertise, or something that he doesn't have in his gear. That could present a challenge. Maybe if he needs a device, maybe he needs to kill a particular non-player character to get his hands on that device, or maybe he needs to fight his way towards a prisoner that is actually knowledgeable in operating a system. So it's all about that. Or maybe you could also create a more powerful and resourceful player character. This is probably my favorite way of handling things because it mimics those amazing heroes from fantasy literature. Like, for example, Conan and Solomon Kane, probably the most solo type of adventurers. They are a one-man party. Each one of them represents a one-man party because they know so many things and they are so good at fighting. Just let's take Conan as an example. Many people that are not familiar with the short stories of Conan think that he's just like a big dumb barbarian, that he's all muscles and no brains. But Conan is quite witty, a genius, perhaps in strategies and tactics. I would consider him a genius. He's also quite knowledgeable in cultures and even some arcane matters. for all of his talk that he despises magic and he distrusts all things supernatural, he's actually quite knowledgeable in that. There are some of his adventures in which he can even identify the weaknesses of some demons because of things that he has learned. So Conan, he's obviously more focused on the physical side of things, but he also sometimes he relies on his knowledge on some obscure matters. And Solomon Kane, it's the same thing. You have this Puritan fighter type of character or shootist, and he also relies on some additional knowledge. So those characters have they're almost like super specialists. They're not, I wouldn't say jack of all trades, but they have like 3 or 4 areas in which they're really good at. So there are some books and resources that can help you match those characters. For example, maybe you are playing Pathfinder and you have the books Pathfinder Unchained and Pathfinder Mythic Adventures. With those books you can create a very powerful player character, a single player character. Because for example, maybe you decide to use the skill variations in Pathfinder Unchained. They basically allow you to be very decent, if not good, at a different broad set of skills. Normally in Pathfinder you have to specialize in separate skills, but with Pathfinder Unchained your character is going to be good at climbing and moving about stealthily, about maybe he has a lot of knowledge concerning the planes, because they take all of those skills and they make the list a bit more compact so that your character is a bit more slightly more on the jack of all trades side of things. And with Mythic Adventures, just by adding a single tier of mythic power, your character becomes quite formidable in combat. I think, I don't remember exactly how much, but I think your challenge rating goes up by 1 or 2 levels with just one single tier of mythic power. So maybe you have this adventure that requires 3 or 4 player characters. Now you can create a single player character and you just give him 1 tier of mythic power and he can take on the adventure on his own, either through combat or perhaps by the skills or abilities because of the mythic tier. And there are many other systems like in old school Renaissance, like I mentioned, Scarlet Heroes is completely tailored on the one-on-one experience. You could also use Stars Without Numbers 2nd edition, you have that rules variations as well. I'm going to put a few links in the description below to the reviews of the things that I mentioned, but also to the Drive-Thru RPG section of Kevin Crawford's books and games. So you can download some free things. There are actually 2 free supplements that allow you to modify any old school Renaissance game, either fantasy or sci-fi, so that you can make the character stronger, more powerful. You basically make it so that the enemies deal less damage against that character, and that character deals a lot more damage. So instead of dealing hit points, you actually deal hit dice of damage. You also have a die that allows you to bend the rules a bit. So for example, maybe your fighter is trying to unlock a door that is just too strong for him to break through or bash that door. So you use this special die to get help from something else. Maybe a non-player character walks in and he's actually able to open that door for a price or for a cut of the treasure that the fighter is looking for. So there are many ways. You could also, perhaps the fighter by chance activates a device that opens that door, but there is a limit in that system. Every time you do that, the dice goes down, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I've used that system. So for that session there will be a time where you can no longer use that extra help so freely. Let's see. Godbound is another good example of Kevin Crawford's game. You basically play as a demigod on his path to godhood. So one single player character can take on an entire adventure, can take on armies even. So you should consider those as an alternative to having this powerful player character that can take on anything. Other examples could include the 2d20 system of Modiphius, Conan, Adventures in an Age of Dreamed Of, or Mutant Chronicles, the John Carter RPG, I think it's called John Carter of Mars. All of those games in the 2D20 that use the 2D20 engine or system, they are perfect for that. The characters are just so awesome. A single player character, as long as that character focuses on his area of expertise, he can take an entire adventure. It's somewhat disappointing that some of the adventures released by Modifius, they do not have scaling information, but they are still pretty good. And as a game master, as a skilled game master, you will obviously be able to scale down those encounters that feel too powerful for a single player character. And you have those devices or mechanisms such as using hordes of enemies, so that you still feel this player character taking on many enemies at the same time, but it's basically just one enemy that gets some bonuses because of the additional numbers of enemies. So it's a very it's a good consideration. You should consider playing those games, and especially if you don't want games that are too heavy on the skill side of things. I have the John Carter of Mars RPG. I haven't played it yet. I have read through it, and it seems that it handles that. Yes, how do you call it? Hyper expertise, hyper capability. It's basically, it reflects those pulp stories in which the character, because he knows how to drive a car, he automatically knows how to operate a starship or spaceship or a boat or ride a horse. So these characters know pretty much everything, because in those pulp stories it was needed to have some exciting adventures to move the story forward. A single player character basically knew how to operate everything and anything in that particular setting or world. So John Carter of Mars actually does a great job to represent that. A single player character, hyper competency, that's the term, that is competent at pretty much everything. Let's see. You could also have a single player create and run several player characters. Now there is a problem here. You require a somewhat experienced role player. Not always, but some players find it too much to control several player characters at the same time. But it's still possible. As game masters, we have always been running several groups of several non-player characters during different combat encounters and non-violent encounters in villages and cities. So it's possible for a single player to control even, let's say, 8 or 12 player characters. It's not impossible. It's just, you just need to adjust yourself to it and be a bit patient. That is, as a game master, you should wait for the player to make the right decisions and choices, because maybe he is not familiar with all of the spells, all of the feats, all of the abilities of the characters that he is going to be handling. So I think this is a good approach if the player is comfortable, because that way you have a realistic story. Some people could believe it to be too exaggerated when you only have one hero taking on the entire world, but here you could have a group of 4 player characters or 3, and they would be adding their skills, their powers, their abilities to the adventure. So that's a really good choice, having several player characters. You could also, this is a really interesting choice that I've used a couple of times. It has actually worked quite well. You basically have ghost party members. That is, the party members are there, but you do not move them in combat. You do not make checks for them all the time. They are just there for when they are needed for the story to move forwards. So you have your, let's say, this character, this player that decided to play as a wizard. So every time there is a combat encounter, you just reduce the number of combatants. Let's say in a room you need to fight 5 orcs, but you make it so that only 2 orcs are going to attack the wizard. You say that the other 3 orcs are busy fighting the fighter or the warrior or the other members in the party. Or maybe the wizard is going through this corridor that is filled with traps, and then you make it so that the thief has automatically disarmed all the traps. Or maybe you want to make a simple roll just to add some randomness and some challenges to when they move through that corridor. And now perhaps if they succeed at disarming those traps, they go through the corridor, no problem. But maybe the thief failed his check, and now the wizard takes a point or two of damage. You could also be a bit less severe, so that the wizard has an opportunity of clearing the adventure on his own. So the ghost party members is all about that, having those members in the party when they are needed. Maybe you have a cleric to heal the wizard. Maybe you can make it so that the cleric only has 3 spells per day to use on the wizard, and maybe he used the others on the other members of the party. And now the wizard has a bit of a, let's say, a way of couching the damage that he's going to suffer through the cleric's healing potential. And I think it's all about limiting that so that it doesn't feel like he's going to be healed all the time. You could also create some random tables to handle these ghost party members, because maybe you are playing as a rogue and you want to backstab your enemies, of course. So, and unless you're going to be trying to sneak around or hide all the time, you also want to backstab them in combat, get that flanking bonus. So maybe you make a roll during each combat round and you tell the thief player, oh, during this round I rolled 1, and this means that the fighter is actually keeping this enemy over there busy. So now you have a chance to backstab that enemy, but it's only going to last 4, and you make another roll. You have 3 turns to backstab that enemy. So that's one way of handling things. I think the ghost party members are the best choice when you have a single player that wants to be part of a party, but is not comfortable enough when handling several player characters at the same time. Let's see. Yes, and in this case you can also use those extra party members as extra lives if you wanted to. Maybe you are moving through a room and there is a trap where the floor collapses and you fall into this pool of lava. Maybe the wizard, back to our example of the wizard, maybe he failed his saving throw and now he's falling into the lava, but because he still has 3 other members in his party, you make it so that the fighter actually managed to jump in and save the wizard, but while doing so he fell down to the lava and he died. So that's a way of taking a casualty. And so now the wizard is only traveling with the cleric and the rogue, and those are like 2 lives, to put it in video game terms. So there are many ways in which you can handle these ghost party members to suit your needs. Another good tip is to talk with the player beforehand. In the case of the shy player that is not very communicative or doesn't talk too much during the game, where it's just one-on-one, and explain that the adventure won't go forward unless he is proactive, because some players usually like to talk a lot with the other members in the party, that is with other players, before taking action, and this player perhaps becomes a bit paralyzed because he's expecting for other people to give him some advice or opinions, and we will talk more about that later on. So you have to talk with that player and explain that because it's just a single player character taking on an entire adventure by himself, all of the choices and responsibility will be on him. Another good tip is to encourage the player to interact and rely on non-player characters for powers, items, skills, and abilities that he may lack. So maybe you are moving your paladin across these ruins and you stumble upon this writing on the wall, and the paladin is not knowledgeable on how to perhaps translate those strange markings or letters or whatever, or glyphs. And maybe later on you can hire a scholar and escort that scholar over there. That could be another opportunity for adventure and for challenges, so that scholar translates that, and maybe it gives the paladin some important clue to solve a particular quest, to find some hidden treasure. It could be anything. So anything that your character cannot take on because of his limited skill set, or maybe he doesn't have a power or an ability to take on a challenge, he can go and look for help for a non-player character to solve that challenge, that problem. Or maybe you can even buy something to solve that problem. For example, in Pathfinder you have, I think it was the Bell of Chiming. It was a bell, if I'm not mistaken, that actually opens secret passageways and doors. So maybe if you don't have if the player character is not a thief or a rogue or someone who is quite savvy at finding and opening secret passageways and doors and whatnot, you can buy that bell, and now you can open those doors somewhat easily. So you in that case, you need to accumulate enough money to hire those non-player characters, or at least do some favors for them so that they help you when you need them, or get those magical items as well. Maybe you need to quest for those items, or you need just buy them. Now I'm going to give a few additional tips. I would recommend that if you're playing with if you're a game master and you're playing with another person as a player character, don't control additional party members as a game master. You're already controlling many of the non-player characters, all of the non-player characters in the game. If you start to control the wizard or the cleric and the rogue, just so that the single fighter feels like he's supported by those extra party members, it could be a bit tedious or quite taxing on you. It's much better if that player controls all the player characters, or if you handle the ghost party members that I mentioned. Now, if you're using ghost party members, you need to keep a tight lid on the information that is shared with the player. Some players rely too much on these ghost party members. I remember one time where I first used this concept of ghost party members. The player always wanted to talk to each of the ghost party members before going into the next room. He went into this cavern and he wanted to talk to the wizard, the cleric, and the rogue. Then he went into this torture chamber, and again he wanted to talk to the rogue, to the wizard, and the fighter. And it becomes really the adventure slows down too much. So I recommend that, and I learned this the hard way, I would recommend that you tell the player before that when he goes into a particular room or corridor or whatever, if the other members in the party are not going to comment, if they don't comment anything, it means that they do not know how to proceed. So that saves you a lot of trouble as a game master. Maybe they enter this section of the arcane tower with some sort of crystals, and if the wizard in the group knows something, then you can, as a game master, you can say something like, "Oh, I recognize those crystals." If you get too close to them, they will actually activate and attack you with a lightning bolt or whatever. So that way the player is a bit more comfortable in not having to ask each of the party members all the time. Because when you have several players participating with a player character each, they on their own, they're going to give their opinions, they're going to talk, act on their character's knowledge. So it's unnecessary for a single player character to start talking. I want to talk to the wizard. Oh, I want to talk to the rogue. I want to talk to the fighter. It's already set up, so to speak. I also recommend, that's another reason as to why I recommend that as a game master, you do not control the other members in the group. Because sometimes you get a bit biased. You already know what's going to happen in the adventure, and sometimes you either help the player too much or you hinder him too much because you try to remain unbiased. Maybe another way to do this would be to use, for example, the hostile artificial intelligence system for war games, but apply them to the way in which the player characters are going to act, or some other type of random system, so that you do not have to control those player characters and they act based on that artificial intelligence. You could also use the Mythic Game Master Emulator. You just need to modify a few things. Yes. Maybe in a month or two, I want to talk about a very interesting system that it looks a bit like Mythic, but it's not. So you could say it's the other side of the coin. And I think that system could actually be a good system to use to control these other members of the party. When I actually review that system, if you haven't seen my review, I come back to this video and I'm going to put it in the description below so that you know what that system is. I need to test it first. I don't want to recommend it before testing it because it's a very somewhat of a new concept in my opinion, so I still need to test it so I can fully recommend it. So keep that in mind, that there could be some ways to simulate the artificial intelligence of player characters. Let's see, more tips. Yes, if you are playing a puzzle or investigation heavy type of scenario or campaign, you have to rely on failing forward rather than just dealing out dire consequences. So instead of giving away success, as some game masters do with those investigation type of scenarios, or making things too hard that if that investigator failed to piece together some sort of clue, he gets killed or the entire mission goes down the drain. It's better to allow for failure that results perhaps in the death of a non-player character or some dishonor or something that affects the character's prestige rather than just ending the adventure altogether. It all depends. So for example, let's use as a model or example a typical Lovecraftian story. You have this single character, a dilettante or student or professor or pretty much any of Lovecraft's typical characters, a member of the decadent nobility, it could be anyone, and he is trying to make sense of a mystery concerning the mythos or Cthulhu or anything. So now, as in many of Lovecraft's stories, that player character is ill-equipped in handling perhaps physical situations or some more obscure mythos related type of situations. So that player character is going to suffer in some checks and tests, and he's going to miss clues, and he's not going to be able to make sense of things in time. So this could add to the drama, spice up the story. Maybe that character failed in figuring out a clue, unraveling a mystery, and now a non-player character died because of that. Or maybe he takes sanity damage. Or maybe someone else becomes insane because he didn't make it in time to stop a ritual against someone, and that person has fallen under the dreadful curse of this or that. So always keep that sense of failing forward. The story keeps on moving forward, but the character has suffered throughout his career for every miss, for every failure that in his attempts of unraveling the mystery. Another good example of this, maybe the romanticized version of Jack the Ripper, where you have a single inspector and Jack the Ripper, and the inspector is trying to find out who Jack the Ripper is and stop him. Of course, in the real life case, it's a lot more complex, but in a, let's say, simplified romantic version of it, maybe the player character is the inspector and he's trying to follow the trail of Jack the Ripper, making sense of his letters, and Jack the Ripper is still doing his own thing, and if the inspector misses a clue or if he fails a check, now Jack the Ripper killed another woman. So that's a way of failing forward. So in those investigation heavy or mystery heavy or puzzle heavy type of scenarios and adventures, it's better to have that failing forward mechanism and just have a few moments in which the player character, if he misses a clue or fails at something related to investigation, he ends up killed or his career is over. So keep that in mind in those moments. And of course, I'm sure that there are many tips and advice that can be given to handle those one-on-one type of experiences. So if you have additional tips or advice, please leave a comment below on that, or maybe you have some interesting experiences or anecdotes concerning one-on-one RPG sessions, or maybe make a video response or anything that you like. It will add to the toolbox so that people, when they watch this video, they have more references, more material on how to handle a good one-on-one RPG session. Well, thanks for watching this video, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below, or leave them below. See you later.